Hi, welcome to this introductory session of the Social System Mapping Community of Practice on-ramp. So I'm Christine Capra of Greater Than the Sum, and today I'm going to try to clarify some of the confusion around what social system mapping actually is. So social system mapping is a relatively new genre of mapping. So it's made possible by the combination of two new technology platforms, Kumu for visualizing and sumApp for data gathering. And it's very much a natural evolution of existing types of maps. So I like to say that it's a mashup of a social network map, an asset map, and a system map, and perhaps even some other kinds of maps. And the purpose of that mashup is to take your network on a learning journey that can help your network become more adaptive, resilient, and self-organizing. This journey includes learning a powerful new visual language together, and in the process, creating a richly informative tool for your network to use in its system change efforts. So when I say it's a mashup, I mean the content of the map includes the kinds of content that you'd get in all three of the other kinds of maps. But more importantly, we also take elements of the processes and the purposes of those three maps so that we end up with something that resonates with all of them, but whose use is very different from any of them. But, I know that still just sounds like a bunch of jargon, and it doesn't really mean anything to anyone. So in order to parse out what it is I'm trying to get across, let's briefly review what each of these kinds of maps show us and what they're used for. So let's start with a social network analysis map, or SNA for short. I'm sure all of you have seen lots and lots of these. This one comes from a paper by June Hawley, and it's the typical kind of map that you'll see when somebody is doing a social network analysis. The little blue squares represent people, and the lines represent some kind of existing relationship between the two people. They're friends, or they work together, or they follow each other on Twitter, or something like that. And then a social network analysis is purely about the existing relationships between people. It's about the patterns of those relationships and what the math underneath those patterns can tell you about how the individuals in the network are positioned. So who has what kinds of influence, who plays what kinds of social role within the network. It can also tell you things about what stage of development your network is in. So this is a really useful snapshot in time, top-down analysis done by essentially an SNA expert who writes up a report to help understand what currently exists. Now, there's a visual language going on in there, but most people can't read it. And frankly, going through the SNA process rarely helps us learn to read it, nor does it really inspire us to learn to read it. So once it's done, it's usually put in a drawer and forgotten about. And so for a long time, given the tools that were available, that's what you got with a standard social network analysis. Then Kumu came along about 6 years ago. So this is Kumu. As you can see, it's online. It's an interactive network graph visualization tool. So in a way, Kumu is kind of like the Gutenberg press for this new visual language that I'm talking about. It democratizes our ability to publish and share network graphs. Anyone can make one in Kumu, and they look pretty cool. So a network graph is any visualization that shows dots with lines connecting them. So all of these are variations of network graphs. And Kumu has lots more kinds of them that are really fun to check out. So network graphs are sort of like the grammar of this new visual language that I'm referring to. You can communicate a whole lot of information with these kinds of graphs that you just can't communicate any other way. Anyway, Kumu enabled people to do things like this. So, for instance, let's say that you're hosting a big event and you add a question to your registration form asking everyone who signs up to attend what their top 3 interests are, which they then select from a list. Well, with Kumu, you can load that data then into a map, and then you can cluster on those responses. So here we can see that all of these people are interested in sustainability, for instance, whereas all of these people are interested in children and youth. So then a variation on this theme is to show the skills that network members have that they're willing to share with the network. For instance, I'm into tool building, whereas these people are all really great facilitators. So this then makes this a kind of an asset map, helping network members learn about and access assets that are available to them through the network. Now, because of the way that this kind of data is usually gathered, these particular kinds of maps generally don't include the who knows who kinds of connections that you see with an SNA. So in this case, it's not about visualizing actual interpersonal relationships and their patterns. It's about showing us things that we have in common that could become useful relationships if people use those commonalities as reasons to reach out and connect to one another, or if others in the network use them to introduce people that they know to one another. But because these maps are accessible to the entire network online, they could theoretically have more ongoing use than a pure SNA does. And then these potential connections and assets add a layer of value and meaning and readability to the map that has less to do with how the individuals are positioned in the network and what kinds of influence they currently have, and has more to do with enabling the individuals themselves to start to read what the map says, reach out to one another, and start to reshape the network based on the things that they have in common and their possible synergies. So it's less of a top-down and less of an expert-driven approach. It's more about trying to generate agency and self-organizing within the network. It's also less about what already exists and more about the future potential hidden inside of the network. So it's an important movement towards helping the network read and act upon the new visual language. And then we have system maps. So, as I'm sure you're familiar, system maps are about the cause and effect relationships between forces in a system. So these are great for gaining insight into the complexity of a system, hopefully finding some of the root causes of problems within systems, and identifying places within a system where you can have the most impact with the least effort. So we call those leverage points. Now, system maps can be generated in a couple different ways. First of all, and for a long time this was the most common approach, a system map would be developed by a group of external system thinking, probably scientist experts. And when the forces in the system in question are mostly sciencey concepts, like what's causing the glaciers to be melting more quickly than they used to, then you do really want sciencey experts. But when it comes to complex and contentious human systems, then the external expert approach is going to be less impactful. And that's because, as you all know, in contentious human systems, change comes from the hearts and minds of the people within the system. But for most of us, a map about our own lives or work made by some unknown outside expert using words that we don't necessarily relate to isn't likely to touch our hearts or change our thinking. So with the expert approach, once it's done, it usually gets put away in a drawer somewhere. Now, if they've done a good job, the key points might be acted upon, but the map itself is forgotten. And since the members of the system were only marginally involved in the process, if at all, there's not a whole lot for them to remember or to have gained from the activity. It's a missed learning opportunity that leaves all of the potential power of these maps in the hands of the experts. The other approach is to generate the system map collaboratively over time through a dialogue process involving people representing all of the various stakeholders who are part of or impacted by a system. So when a map is generated collaboratively from multiple perspectives, the community's own language becomes translated into this new visual language, and they can begin to understand the hidden complexity in the situation together. So as the group begins to identify the relevant forces and the relationships between them, the system mapping process itself points to discussions that need to be had, because different stakeholders are going to have very different perspectives about what the systemic forces are or how they interpret them, and a collaborative system map surfaces those differences. And then, since the mapping can't really proceed without those conversations, it actually triggers those discussions. And once those discussions are done, it records the conclusions that those discussions arrived at. So when done well, a collaboratively generated system map becomes a map of those discussions about a system. And again, the process itself helps everyone from the different perspectives understand each other better. So in that way, the process of system mapping itself can be an intervention, no matter what the map that you end up with looks like. Everyone who engages in the process not only understands the system in question better, but it teaches them to think more systemically in general. It also gives them a new collective skill set, in addition to the shared understanding. And when they look at the map, they remember the discussions and the insights that created it, all of which makes it much more personally meaningful to them and helps them learn and use this new visual language that I'm talking about. Okay, so having looked at social network analysis maps, asset maps, and system maps, let's return to the question of what is a social system map? Or put another way, what's the difference between a social system map and a network map? I get that question a lot. Well, in fact, and I alluded to this earlier, it's only minimally about the content. Overall, you do end up having more content in a social system map than in any of the other types, and there are more dimensions to that content. But if we focus on the content, we overlook the more impactful differences, because, as I mentioned earlier, the impact comes from the process and from a really different purpose. So when I say that a social system map is a mashup of those other three kinds of maps, what I mean is that with a social system map, we're layering all of these kinds of maps on top of one another. So the foundation and the usual beginning point is the SNA map, because human relationships are the building blocks of all human systems, so to us, those relationships are primary. But then we also layer in those potential future relationships based on commonalities or on the potential for shared action that you get from an asset map. So here, it's already beginning to be a hybrid of a network and an asset map. At this point, there will still be more work that you generally need to do to help shift people's thinking so that they understand what the map offers them and so that they'll feel comfortable taking advantage of the information that they have access to. Because in my experience, most people will glance at a network map and then ask me to tell them what to do with it. The paradigm is still very much, you're the expert, you tell me. But nonetheless, this hybrid is a move in the direction of increasing agency throughout the network and fostering self-organization, because the information is there and they can access it whenever they want. And you can go pretty deep with all of that stuff without ever getting into talking explicitly about systems. So you don't need to convince anyone up front to engage in a big collective systems thinking process in order to get going with those two layers. You just need the right tools and an excuse to get started. But then, the more you engage the network around designing the map and sense-making with the map, the better people will be able to read these maps. So they'll take advantage of them more readily, and the maps will gradually become more useful to everyone. So to really get the most out of this hybrid kind of map, you do need to engage in some kinds of convening around them. And then, once you've started doing that, the fact is, all of those things that we've already included, that I just referred to, actually are elements of a system. A network is a system, and all of those potential connections point to stuff that can flow through the system. So at some point, especially in change networks, it's really helpful to be explicit and to recognize this is a map of a social or a human system. And when we think of it that way, we can start to become even more explicit about representing and understanding the forces impacting the systems that we're trying to change. We can begin to think about how we each relate to those forces, what those relationships are about, and what they might mean for our overall intentions. So as we gradually deepen our ability to read the map and dig deeper into the dimensions that we can map, we begin to use the map as a systems thinking and learning tool as well. It can start to have the impact that a collaborative system mapping process has, but with those additional layers that include the personal human relationships that are influencing the system. Eventually, then, the content of a social system map includes actual personal relationships, potential relationships, plus people's connections to other forces in the system, which gives you and your network members more insight into the social and systemic context of those relational patterns. And the value of combining all this content into one constantly shifting, often fairly messy social system map is to really develop and learn together this new language of network graphing that helps us understand the complexity in systems and in networks. But at the same time, it's something that you can ease into. There's no need to start it out as a great, big, ambitious undertaking or try to convince everyone that they need to go through this big, mysterious learning ordeal. The process itself can start with small steps and can be somewhat the same as an asset map process or a social network analysis process, but with a social system map, both the map and the process are more iterative and emergent. You can just keep adding more people. It tracks changes in relationships over time. You can change or add survey questions as you gain more insight into what's relevant. So that the map and the process itself keeps evolving through a cycle of increasingly collective envisioning, mapping, and sense-making phases. And then, while cycling through these phases, if you keep on scratching another layer deeper and another layer deeper, your network will gradually discover that you've been engaging in a collective learning journey. A journey that, ideally, has fostered more agency, greater network awareness, an increased capacity for systems thinking, more shared understanding, and a shared new visual language skill. And those things together, we would expect to have made your network more adaptive and resilient and self-organizing. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks for your attention, and you can always find more at our knowledge base, which is at help.sum-app.net. So thanks again.